One. Very happy to have you all with us this evening for our virtual experience of Bermudian Heartbeats. This is our event entitled Death in Paradise, Stories of Mystery and Murder Most Foul, obviously our October offering. Tonight we have 5 storytellers who will give you some of the background of some of Bermuda's probably in some cases well-known stories of murder and mystery, some lesser known stories. In some cases, they go the route of folklore. In some cases, they go the route of archaeology. But in each case, I think that you will find this interesting and certainly an interesting part of our history. Our first speaker for tonight is Mr. Andrew Birmingham. Mr. Birmingham is president of the Bermuda Historical Society, and he's also a founding member of the Bermudian Heartbeats Committee, which is now, I think, in its 15th year. So please join me in welcoming Andrew Birmingham.
Good evening, everyone. This evening got the chance to share with you some details of 3 murders that occurred in Bermuda in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. The Skeeters case is famous for primarily, it was gruesome, and it was also a case involving the ill treatment of women in Bermuda towards the end of the 19th century. Edward Skeeters and his wife Anna lived in a cottage, an isolated cottage near Daniel's Head on Long Bay. Anna was 41 years old and an attractive woman who had been in an association with a chap before she met Edward and had a disabled child. The Skeeters was, to quote the best phrase, it was a nasty piece of work. He had a reputation for womanizing, philandering, and had a bad temper. But he had the support of a very devoted mother. The event started on one evening, on a Sunday evening at St. James's Churchyard in Somerset. Anna Skeeters went to watch a wedding and attend service. There she met up with Elizabeth Morris and her 2 daughters. Elizabeth Morris and the 2 daughters were on intimate relations with Edward Skeeters. And in fact, Anna Morris had a baby by him some months later. The 3 women berated Anna for being associated with such a carefree character as Edward Skeeters. And that was the last seen of her alive. Edward Skeeters finally reported to the police, finally reported to the authorities that his wife had gone missing the following day. And he ventured into Hamilton and asked the Royal Gazette reporter if they would post a wanted, a missing person notice. Meanwhile, a crowd of local residents had gone to Skeeter's house, searched it in an effort to locate Anna. The situation got so bad that the local JP, Mr. Fowle, had Skeeters locked up in the old Somerset police station. There was no sign of her. All we knew was that Skeeters had threatened his wife. She had in turn, after 8 years of abuse, left him on 1 or 2 occasions only to return. About a week later, a group of men were lounging about on a grassy knoll near Long Bay, and the water was choppy. And then they noticed a calm patch near the shore. And they decided when the weather subsided, they would row out and check what it was. And sure enough, they rowed out put down some grappling hooks, and up they dredged the partial remains of Anna and her clothing. The authorities were alerted, and Captain Moresby of Moresby Plain fame was contacted and sent 2 helmet divers from the Royal Navy down to inspect what was there. There they found, tied to a rock, the remains of Anna Skeeters. The police, meanwhile, had been summoned and had, in fact, before the discovery of the body, found some blood-stained clothing. But Skeeters was still quite confident they would never find the body. But he was proven wrong. He was subsequently obviously arrested, and he was put on trial in June of 1879. The trial lasted about a month, and he was housed in the jail in Hamilton, which is now the site of the post office. I can remember it when I came to Bermuda in 1964, the old jail. Skeeters was tried, found guilty of murder, and his defense team admitted they had a very weak case to defend him. Skeeters subsequently made a death cell confession, which he wrote, and he said that he'd lost his temper having thrown a kerosene lamp at Anna, knocked her out, and then decided, quote, to finish her off. Skeeters went to the gallows on the 2nd of July, 1879. Prior to his execution, 15 Bermudian men were paid $1 an hour for 60 hours to watch him for a month. He faced his fate stoically, and of course the story takes on some more mythical proportions when he was buried on Burt's Island, also known as Skeeters Island. And the suggestion was the rock that he used to tie down Anna's body in the water was the rock that is his headstone of his grave. As you know, Burt's Island became a prisoner of war camp in 1901. So here we have a tale of the abuse of women, late 18th century, 19th century, in which matters like this are still being addressed today. And it's an unfortunate, story, a sad story, but the best person to read on account of it is by Sandra Campbell. In August this year, in the Bermudian magazine, she gives a very, very good analysis of Skeeter's behavior pro-women as it relates to modern day Bermuda, and advise anyone when you finish viewing this program, look up Bermudian magazine on Google and read the story by Miss Campbell. It's really first class. So that's number one in the stories I'm going to narrate. The second story relates to a young 13-year-old South African boy called Frankie Bosch. Frankie Bosch fought in the Boer War. He came from a very good family in Pretoria, South Africa. And on the outbreak of the war in October, November 1899, he really eloped from his family and joined the Boer War commandos. He fought at Ladysmith, and on the 6th of January was badly wounded in his heel, taken prisoner, as were the other members of his commando, and put in a POW camp in South Africa until May 1901, when he arrived in Bermuda on the first batch of prisoners, 850, into Hamilton. Henkie Bosch was put on Tucker's Island, one of the 6 POW camps, along with 800 other prisoners. Of the 4,619 prisoners that came from South Africa, 850 were aged 18 or younger, and the youngest was 6. Henkie Bosch had a rebellious spirit, and he was a well-known prankster. The guards on the islands were the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. Each camp had a barbed wire fence, the British on one side, the Boers on the other. On the 27th of April, 1902, after about a year in Bermuda, Henkie Bosch and his 5 other prisoners decided to make a breakout, and they bribed a guard called William to give him money to allow them to jump over the wire. The stage was set for the escape, and unfortunately for Henkie, the lead man didn't go, so he took his chance, jumped the wire, and was shot in the back. Killed instantly. Henkie Bosch was buried on Long Island Cemetery the following day, the 28th of April, 1902. The guard was never properly investigated, and of all the prisoners that came here, only 35 died in captivity. Of the 4,619 prisoners brought to Bermuda, Henkie Bosch, murdered, was the only one to die from hostile action. His father was a 43-year-old, well-to-do Afrikaner from Pretoria, and the weight of the loss of Henkie weighed heavily on him, and he died of a stroke about 6 months later. Henkie Bosch is still remembered in South Africa as a war hero. If you go out to Long Island, either in the ensuing months, go to grave number 22 of the Boer Cemetery, and you can pay your respects to Henkie Bosch. The third tale is one close to my heart. It involves the Bermuda Police and involves Cambridge Beaches. Cambridge Beaches has some old properties on it, and the 3 participants in this mystery are Hugh Gray, Alice Seeley, and Inspector Dennis Alderson of the Bermuda Police. Hugh Seeley was a purser or a cruise director on the early passenger ships, the Furnace Withy ships that came into Bermuda. In 1924, he married Anne Seeley. Anne Seeley was a socialite from New England, educated at Columbia University, and to some, way above the station of Hugh Gray. Hugh Gray was an opportunist and a man who saw chances of making money in Bermuda. He came ashore in 1925, and he and Alice married 24. He and Alice ran Newstead. They then went to live at Cambridge, which was a house bought by Seeley and Ruth Seeley's mother, mother and father. The upshot of this was that Hugh Gray developed his business, and it was 10 years later that Dennis Alderson appeared on the scene. Dennis Alderson was a policeman, only 24 years old, well-educated, Malvern College, and all the traditional trappings of upper middle-class Britain, who joined the colonial police. He was transferred as a fully fledged inspector to Bermuda in about 1923. He was known to be a snappy dresser. He was well known to Police Constable Vernon Jackson of the Bermuda Police and the Blue Jay restaurant subsequently. Vernon was Wayne Jackson's father. The story is that in February 1925, height of winter, Vernon Jackson saw Inspector Alderson at the Richmond Road train station. And Vernon was told by Inspector Alderson, Dennis, he was on his way to see his friend at Cambridge Beaches. And sure enough, that was the last that Vernon Jackson ever saw of Inspector Alderson. The tale, if you can believe it, is this. He went up there and he met up with the Greys and another colleague. And around midnight, they decided to have a supper. By 1 o'clock, Inspector Alderson said he'd like to go for a moonlight sail. And the other participants said he wasn't interested, but they did persuade Hugh Grey and his wife to go out. Alderson went off to get his boat. Hugh Grey could not swim. They set off into Mangrove Bay on a moonlit, rather windy night. And after about 20 minutes, a squall came up and the boat was overturned. The three of them went into the water. After an hour, the inspector decided to swim to the shore, which he did, leaving Mr. and Mrs. Grey hanging onto the boat. Mrs. Grey, about an hour later, said that she was very, very cold and she was going to try and swim for it as well. That was the last that Hugh Grey ever saw of the pair of them. The upshot was that it was reported to the police and the authorities, big search. Nothing was ever seen of Mrs. Grey again. However, about 10 days later, a report came that there were a body being dredged up or washed up at Spanish Point. Vernon Jackson went to the scene. I mentioned that Alderson was a very snappy dresser, and around his waist he used to wear a very colourful cummerbund. And the first thing that Vernon Jackson noticed was that the cummerbund was tied tightly round Miss Inspector Alderson's neck. There was subsequently an inquest which was conducted by the coroner and Ivo Staunton, the Commissioner of Police. There was only one witness, and that was Hugh Grey. And during the cross-examination, Inspector or Chief of Police Staunton wanted to put certain questions to Mr. Grey. The coroner interceded and said, "Why are you harassing the witness? I'm going to close this inquest down and say it was the verdict of accidental drowning in relation to Mrs. Grey and Inspector Alderson." So the bottom line here is, why were they out at 1 in the morning? Squall knocks over their boat, and 3 hours later, cries were heard on shore, and Police Constable George Down and another man rowed out to the scene and rescued Hugh Grey. Hugh Grey went on to make a fortune at Cambridge Beaches. So the rumours ran rife as to what had happened to this pair. But as I said, the story has never had a complete ending. So that, Kim, is the story of Inspector Alderson and Mrs. Grey.
Great. Thank you very much for the story, Andy.
Just two things I must mention. In 1975, I went to George Downes' house met he and his wife Florence Down. He was a policeman from 1915 to 46, and his dad was a policeman before him. And I was interested in police memorabilia. And he said to me, I've got a souvenir for you. And he gave me a piece of rope that hung skeeters. This rope is in the Bermuda Historical Society, a most grim, macabre remnant of that skeeter's case.
Thank you very much, Andy. It's interesting as a footnote to that story that when you go to Cambridge Beaches, they actually have one of their rooms, because the rooms are named different things. In some cases, very innocuous names like, Longtail Suite or Bermudiana Suite. There actually is one entitled the Skeeter Suite, which I always found extremely odd under the circumstances.
Let me add to that, Kim.
Mhm.
This is written by Colin Bembo. It's the story of Cambridge Beaches. It mentions the Skeeter's room. It covers the loss of Mrs. Gray and Inspector Alderson and the Skeeter's case. And I think you can still get it.
So sorry, that's, can you hold that up again, Andy? It's a history of hospitality
The
by
story
Colin
of
Bembo.
Cambridge.
Right. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. We actually will open you'll be able to ask questions in the Q&A, which we'll respond to at the conclusion of the evening. Thank you, Andrew.
Oh,
Sorry, Andy, you're muted, sorry. Oh, sorry, Andy, you're muted. If you can unmute.
Kim,
Sorry, you'd like to add
my
something?
apology. I must read this, put it in context about Alderson. This is the obituary to Alderson in the paper. O moonlit sea, moonbeams behind the clouds, darkening the moonlit sea. Why have you taken from us a sea lover? Are you not satisfied with those who went before? Were you still greedy for the love of another sea lover? Calm, cruel are your sudden waves and storms. You love not one, nor hate another. You pine for all sea lovers and those that hate your sea. Moonlit upon your moonlit storm, your moonlit arms stretch forth from your great depths, clasping your lovers to yourself forever. Moonlit upon the moonlit sea, cruel as ever.
Wow. My goodness. All right, well, thank you so much, Andy. Our next speaker is Liz Jones. She's a writer, and in addition to novels, Liz is also a freelance writer for the Bermudian magazine. And so a number of stories about Bermuda culture, about our environment that have appeared in Bermudian magazine have been penned by Liz. I will turn it over to her.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to be talking about witchcraft in Bermuda that happened during quite a short period. Seemed rather appropriate. Halloween for many children is the perfect time for dressing up. Every year at parties held in schools and neighborhoods, we see them disguised as popular movie characters, but also as goblins and ghosts and as witches. This weekend will likely prove no different. Young girls carrying brooms will pose as witches in their long dresses and pointed hats with wide brims, and their costumes will be an excuse for light-hearted giggling, for entertainment, not for fear. However, Halloween is also an appropriate time to think back to an era in Bermuda when wearing witches' clothing could be deadly. After all, it was for Alice Moore, who in 1653 was arrested and hanged as a witch, in part because she was allegedly seen through her own window to be wearing such a hat. In the early years of the 1650s, having any association with witchcraft could lead to persecution and execution. Governor Lefroy's Memorials of the Bermudas lists 22 witchcraft cases heard in the court in the State House in St. George's. Out of those 22 accused, 5 were found guilty and hanged on Gallows Island, where Ordnance Island is now. It should be noted that most, but not all, witches accused were female. Some, as you will see, were male, and 1 male was executed. All were white. It is probable the first settlers in Bermuda believed in witchcraft, bringing their beliefs from England with them. A belief in witchery goes way back in European history to pagan times, but continuing long after countries converted to Christianity. From 1484 to 1750, 200,000 witches were executed in England alone. Witch hunting intensified under the reign of witch-fearer James VI of Scotland, first of England. In the first 40-odd years of settlement in Bermuda, church wardens and sidesmen were told to expose all sorcerers, enchanters, charmers, figure casters, and, to quote, whoever hath or seemeth to have any consultation with the devil. But no persecutions of witches during this period happened. It's not that the law in Bermuda was less cruel than in England. Instead of hounding alleged witches, it was focusing on passing new laws to enforce slavery. Punishments for rebelling against slavery were vicious and included whippings, brandings, and hangings. But a crazed vendetta against witches began in the 1650s, with all their executions happening between 1651 and 1655. What could be the reason for this? After Charles I's succession to the throne, the Civil War broke out in England between the Royalists and the Puritan Roundheads. The Royalists lost, and so from 1649 to 1600, England, Wales, and later Ireland and Scotland were ruled as a republic. During this time, Puritans were opposing the High Church near Roman Catholic religious practices of the established Anglican Church. Bermuda was affected in that Puritans, or Independents as they were known, gained a majority on the council here and took a strong stance against witches. They believed witches were not born as such, but deliberately made a conscious pact with the devil. Often they were convinced witches had familiars or demons that would appear in animal form and that witches would suckle. Josias Forster was governor of Bermuda for 3 separate terms in 1642, 1645, and 1650. According to Sister Jean Kennedy's Isle of Devils, Forster was a suspected royalist, but for pragmatic reasons, often took the side of the Puritans in the issues of the day. So, some argue, his collusion with the Puritans explains the fact all 5 executions happened under his 3rd term as governor. An argument against this is that by the time he resumed office in 1650, many leading Puritans had already emigrated from Bermuda to Eleuthera in the Bahamas. In his memorials, Lefroy argues Forster should be held responsible for presiding over many of the trials held in the State House, and not the Puritans. Perhaps Forster shared a fear of the supernatural. Perhaps he enjoyed the acts of legal persecution. It is noteworthy his grandson, Thomas Forster, would become the slave master of Sarah Bassett, burnt at the stake in 1730 for attempting to murder him, his wife, and slave Nancy by poison. Lefroy also thought that Scottish Army prisoners of war who came to Bermuda as indentured servants brought their superstitions with them. As we will see, a Scottish indentured servant's ravings led to the execution of an alleged male witch, John Middleton. Whatever the truth, 1650, just after the interregnum in England, was a time of uncertainty for Bermuda. And during times of uncertainty, people need someone to blame. The smallness of the island also helped to promote quarrels among neighbours and friends, giving rise to spite and revenge for perceived insults. To quote Shakespeare, enter rumour painted full of tongues. During the early 1650s, rumour could be lethal for its victims. Neighbors blame neighbors, calling them witches and holding them responsible for unexplained events such as livestock suddenly dying, allegedly because a neighbor possessed by the devil looked at them. They blame them for children sickening and dying, or for bewitchment of neighbors into inexplicable fits and cramps. They blame them when milk would not churn into butter. They blame them for the appearance of their familiars in the form of cats. After rumor, enter group hysteria. And so, for example, in 1651, Jean Gardner was accused of threatening and bewitching a mixed-race woman called Thomason. She reportedly threatened to cramp the woman, and afterwards Thomason said she was struck blind and dumb for 2 hours. Alice Moore, the one seen with the witch's hat, was accused of ruining a neighbour's soap making and ruining a corn crop through devilish means. In one instance, she apparently went to a man's house to buy a sow, but found the price too high. After she reportedly cursed the sow, the animal died, giving birth to piglets, which also died. Christian Stevenson was accused of making a woman's tongue hang out of her mouth like a beast's tongue for many days, so she could not leave the house. She was also accused of causing butter not to churn and of causing a miscarriage. Were witches convicted on the evidence of rumour? In effect, yes, though a protocol was followed in a ghastly travesty of justice. Rumours would be turned into recorded testimony given by the so-called victims of witches and by witnesses. If that testimony were considered strong enough for a conviction, then the person would be subjected to a grossly intrusive search. His or her naked body would be examined by a team of jurors for blemishes, moles, skin tags that were said to be markings of the devil. Teat-shaped marks were evidence that the accused had suckled familiars. Bluish spots also identified a witch and would be often in their secretest parts and therefore required, quote, diligent and careful search. If just one blemish were found, then the accused would be swum or forced to undergo ordeal by water. If he or she sank, she died. If she floated, then that was proof positive she was held up by the devil. This is what happened to Jean Gardner, who had just one blemish inside her mouth. Having her right thumb tied to her left toe and her left thumb tied to her right toe, she was thrown into water between Market Square and what is now Ordnance Island. She floated, and she was the first convicted witch in Bermuda to be hanged. During this period, not only did neighbour turn against neighbour, friend against friend, but in one instance, also spouse against spouse. In 1652, Elizabeth Middleton of Sands tribe was accused of using many cursed speeches against a young child aged 9 months of her neighbour Anthony White. The baby fell into strange fits and subsequently died, the result, it was said, of Elizabeth's witchcraft in combination with the devil. During her trial, she accused her husband, John, of being the witch, saying they had the wrong hog by the ear. She was acquitted by proclamation without having to submit to a body search. But the following year, thanks to her testimony, her husband was arrested for bewitching his Scottish friend, John Mackerton, who was an indentured servant of Governor Forster. Mackerton fell into fits after Middleton threatened to strike him. Taken to prison for his own protection, Mackerton was heard saying he saw a thing in the shape of a man who sat upon him very heavily and asked if he would love him. In other words, the devil. A boy, Simon, in a neighbouring cell claimed he also saw this manifestation through a hole in the wall. Another witness swore he saw opposite Middleton's house a black creature lay so upon the ground in the shape of a cat, but far bigger, with eyes like fire and a tail near as long as a man's arm. As a result of these accusations, a body search was ordered. 6 men of the jury stretched Middleton's naked body onto a chest and found many bluish marks, teats, and blemishes. Bizarrely, they examined each other for similar marks to be better satisfied among themselves that he was guilty. Middleton was duly thrown into the water. He floated and was found guilty of feloniously, wickedly, and abominably consulting and consenting to and with the devil to become a witch. Recanting her evidence, his wife tried to save him, but to no avail, because he confessed to being a witch, though I knew it not before. The Middleton story does not quite end here. John was asked if he could name other witches. Perhaps out of mental confusion, perhaps out of hope he would be saved as a reward, he gave evidence against 2 other women. The first was Alice Moore, whom he had seen in the witch's hat through her window. He claimed she had scratched him in the face. The second was Christian Stevenson. After an argument with her, he saw her familiars, 2 things in the shape of a cat. Chillingly, while Forster would not accept Elizabeth's evidence, he was able to accept John's, no doubt because it was what he wanted to hear. He ordered all 3 to be hanged. About 350 years have passed since these atrocities were carried out. In Bermuda, we thankfully no longer have capital punishment. However, today rumor can be just as pertinent. It is sobering to think, in our own era of social media and uncertain times, that a person can suffer calumny after just 1 tweet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. As you were telling the story, I was thinking about the film that came out in 2015, The Witch, which I've sort of I've read the summary of it, but I've been too afraid to actually watch it. Maybe I'll get over my fear come October 31st and actually give it a try. But it's that whole thing, particularly with that film, it was based in 1630. And it was this whole idea around a family sort of turning on each other and accusing each other of witchcraft. And so unusual to hear of a husband being accused of witchcraft as well. I wasn't familiar with that story. So very interesting to see the ways in which I suppose the mind can sort of feed upon fear and paranoia, essentially cause people to turn on each other in this way.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Our next speaker is Mr. John Cox. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Mr. Cox, he has certainly been quite a regular fixture in our Bermudian Heartbeat series, particularly during the month of October. Under normal circumstances, in fact, this month we might normally be spending it at Mr. Cox's house, because Orange Valley, for those of you who don't know, the place where Mr. Cox resides, his family home, has been, it's haunted. And we've had a number of really interesting events there over the years where we've had a chance to hear the stories of Orange Valley. I would like to turn it over to Mr. Cox, who is also, I should mention, the vice president of the Bermuda Historical Society as well. He is a writer of folklore and of history. And I'll just ask you to unmute yourself there, John. Over to you.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Kim. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
You can actually see me. So you know where I am, don't you?
I do.
I'm in my haunted house, Orange Valley. So it's nice to share a little bit of Orange Valley with you this evening. And I just have a couple of rather brief stories that I wanted to relate. And I'll get on with the very first one, which is really a really intriguing story that I used to give this talk on my walking tours of St. George's back in the 1970s. Can you imagine that long ago? You've disappeared. Am I still there?
Yes, you're fine, John.
Yeah, you're fine. You can see me. Everything's okay?
Yes.
Okay. It's a little odd because I'm looking at kind of a blank screen, but that's okay. I can get over that. So anyway, so in the 1970s, I used to give, this talk on my walking tour. And when you asked whether I might talk about Joseph Gwynne, I had to go and read it up again. I'd forgotten. Can you imagine 40 years later, I'd forgotten the story. This is what happens to you, you do forget things. Anyway, as you mentioned, I'm very much involved with the Bermuda Historical Society. And we have a couple of very, very beautiful, elegant silver spoons at the museum, at the society. And they were crafted by this fellow named Joseph Gwynn, a young man. He was in his 20s, hadn't even reached 30. One of the spoons, ironically, has a coffin back, which is really kind of spooky because the poor guy ended up not doing well in the end. Anyway, as cool as his silver is, he was pretty hot-headed. And he used to get into a bit of trouble in St. George's, where he lived. Sorry, see what's happening? The ghost is already. See, I can't get very far away from my hauntings here. Can you see me again? Okay, great. He lived in St. George's in a cottage just west of Durnford House, which is quite well known. And as I said, he'd get pretty hot-headed and he'd get into fracas. And one night he got a little bit too carried away, and the magistrate of the town, Dr. Hunter, decided to lock him up. Not for very long, maybe 2 days, 3 days, something like that. But it was enough to really send Joseph Gwynn into quite a frenzy. And he decided that he wanted to do poor Dr. Hunter some harm. So it was a very dark night. He put on his cloak and he concealed a pistol underneath the cloak. And off he went to Dr. Hunter's house, but Dr. Hunter wasn't home. So he decided to hide in the crossroads. Now, the crossroads were where, just by Summers Gardens, you know, where the roads meet there, there's a grocery store and the Bridge House is there. And he hid there waiting for Dr. Hunter to come. So he meant to do Dr. Hunter great harm. Dr. Hunter did not come along, but a poor fellow named Henry Folger, he wasn't poor, he was quite a well-to-do merchant, but the consequences were certainly poor. Gwynn thought this was Dr. Hunter, so he pulled out his pistol and shot Gwynn, shot Henry Folger dead. He realized very quickly, oh my goodness, what have I done? I've killed the wrong man. Oh my gosh, how could I have done such a terrible thing? Well, he ran off into the night. The whole town got totally involved in this. A big search was made. I mean, they went all over the town looking for him, into the graveyard, looking around there. They even went out as far as Ferry Reach, fanned that area, no sign of him. Of course, they ended up going to his cottage. There was his poor wife, inconsolable, sobbing. She could hardly make any sense. Where's this man? Has he come home? She said, no, he hasn't come home. I don't know where he is. Well, days went by. Joseph Gwynn never turned up at the house, so that people thought. People started to believe, well, he obviously left Bermuda. His poor wife was inconsolable still. She'd sit in a rocking chair and just rock by a window, rock, and tears. People would come and try and console her, and she'd be tearful and, oh dear, this is terrible. Anyway, they thought, well, let's just keep an eye on Joseph Gwynn's cottage. So they asked one of the guards up at Fort George to put his telescope on the cottage. Don't take your telescope off that cottage. Watch it. And watch Mrs. Gwynn. Let's see it. Does she stay in her rocker? Or does she get out of the rocker and get up to something? Well, sure enough, after about half an hour, Mrs. Gwynn got out of her rocker, looked out of the window to the street to see that nobody was on the street or nearby. She moves her rocker, pulls up removes a carpet and pulls up a secret hatch. And then she takes a plate of food down below the hatch. Well, so my goodness, this man with the telescope, I think the telescope went right over, and he took off to his superiors and said, I've solved the mystery. Mrs. Gwynn doesn't stay in her rocker. She gets up, moves a carpet, lifts up a hatch, a secret hatch, and takes food down below. Well, the police descended on the cottage, hauled out poor Joseph Gwynn. who, as I say, wasn't even 30. The year was 1826, by the way. I forgot to mention that. He was tried. 2 months later, he was hanged. So very sad story because, you know, he died with great remorse. He meant to kill Dr. Hunter, who he felt had done him a great injustice. He ends up killing this poor innocent man. Probably felt, my God, my soul is going to hell for sure, and dies in a very sad way. And his wife, his widow, never remarried, and she just spent the rest of her days heartbroken, completely heartbroken. But there we have his silver, this beautiful silver. You know, this man who got up to all kinds of mischief produced this most elegant silver. It shows that we all have two sides in this, doesn't it? I guess two sides in everybody, yin and yang. But anyway, the other one, I wanted to just read you a short story that is very close to my heart. You know, I can never get too far away from ghost stories, as you know. And this one has a really kind of interesting twist. This only takes a couple of minutes, but may I read this, Kim? Just a ghost story from one of my books. This was actually recorded by Aubrey Cox in 1890. There's a grave in Devonshire churchyard. In fact, when you come out of the southern door of the old Devonshire church, there's a grave right near the door, and on it is the name John Stone. John Stone. So this is to do with him. I'm going to take my glasses off just to read this. One evening, this is Aubrey Cox writing, just at dusk, my great-grandmother, Christiana Love Dill, who, and by the way, saw the newly dead. Some people would think of it as sort of a blessing. She thought of it as a real curse because it's something that haunted her all her life. So she and my great-grandfather, John Dill, were returning from a visit to their daughter, Mrs. James Hill, who lived in Hill House above Devonshire Bay on the South Shore. My great-grandmother was riding and her husband walked beside her horse. So now they weren't going along South Shore Road or Middle Road or anything like that. They were going on a tribe road. The tribe roads ran from South Shore to North Shore. They were very narrow. So, you know, it was hardly any room. Gosh, sorry about this. Between the horse and Mr. Dill, there's hardly any room for anybody to pass. They were very narrow lanes. As he says here, it was a narrow bridle path with room only for one horse to walk. Just before they reached the house just south of the Devonshire Sunday School, now belonging to the Stone family, and I don't know where that is. It's somewhere in the center part of Devonshire, I'm told. And occupied, at the time was occupied by Mr. John Stone. My great-grandmother said suddenly to her husband, Mr. Dill, how can you imagine she called him Mr. Dill? I mean, it's so formal. Mr. Dill, take me off my horse, for John Stone is riding so near me that he will push me off. Nonsense, Christiana, replied her husband. There's no one there. If you do not take me off my horse, Christiana cried, much agitated, I will jump off, for I tell you, he is riding so near me, he will have me off my horse. Well, taking her in his arms, her husband lifted her to the ground. There's no one there, he said. And my great-grandmother looked around and said, well, there is no one here. Why was I so agitated? I swear Mr. John Stone was riding right through here. My great-grandparents were then, Aubrey's great-grandparents, were then living in a house on the North Shore, just above the little bay on the western side of what is known as Watlington's Point. I can remember seeing this house, then almost in a ruin when I was a very small child. Now, not even a trace of it, not even a trace of the foundation can be seen. It stood to the north of the North Shore Road, just below the hill on which stands the house now known as Seaview, which is just above the incinerator plant. The next afternoon, my great-grandfather, sitting by the window of his house, reading the Bible, saw a boat come into the little bay below the house. Presently, the boatman lifted a coffin from the boat and placed it on the shore. Judge of my great-grandfather's surprise, when on sending a servant to inquire, he was informed it was the body of Mr. John Stone. who had died suddenly and unexpectedly in St. George's the evening before, just at the time he had been seen by my I'm getting goosebumps, my great-grandmother, riding so near her on his horse. It seems he had ridden into St. George's on business the day before and had fallen dead just as he was about to return home. The friends of the deceased gentleman had sent his body up in the boat the next day in order that he might be buried in Devonshire churchyard in the burying place of his family. You know, I always get goosebumps when I read that story. It's funny. You know, it must be the creepiest thing to see the newly dead. And this is something that Christiana had all her life, and several of her descendants, including Freer Cox, David Dill. David Dill, in fact, had the most spooky thing happen Christmas of 1972. He looked across the room at a Christmas party, and there was Governor Sharples, and he saw Governor Sharples being shot. And he said, I have to leave this party. I see the most awful thing. And he went home with his wife and he said, I've just seen the most awful thing. I've seen Governor Sharples shot. And his wife said, well, David, you know, I think, you know, you've had a couple of drinks, haven't you? He said, well, I only had one half a scotch. He said, but that might be enough, because this happened to him over and over. Sure enough, in March of 73, Governor Sharples was assassinated. David Dill never got over it. Oh my goodness, I'm getting, you know, you should see me, Kim. My hairs are all coming up on my arms. He was very, very keen on a college girl, and he just adored her. And he was in a taxi in Bermuda, going home from a party, and the light behind the taxi was so bright. And he went, what is going on? There's such a bright light behind this taxi. And he looked back, and in the light behind the taxi, he saw this girl that he loved drowning. He got back to school or university in September, and he said, where's Rachel? She's not here. They said, well, haven't you heard? Rachel drowned this summer. Drowned the night he saw her in the bright light behind. Oh my goodness, you know, I'm getting such goosebumps. I'm going to have to quit. So there we are, Kim. That's my contribution in my haunted house. And you know what? I have to live in this house, and it's dark now. So there we are. That's my life.
Thank you so much, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
For those of you who are not familiar, I would hope you would be, Bermuda's Favorite Haunts. This is volume 1, and there's also a volume 2 that John has co-written or co-ghosted with Joan Skinner and Mac Musson. So yes, we'll leave you there to Orange Valley, John. I do remember in years past, particularly on October nights, that the sort of misty walk to your front door is certainly does provoke the imagination.
It does, yeah. And right now at this time of the year, the line between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. You know that.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness me, what am I doing to myself? You know, I'm going to go and have a drink after this. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Our next speaker is Catherine Hay. She is a writer who happens to live next door to a graveyard, the Prospect Military Cemetery. Kathy is also a member of the Bermudian Heartbeats Committee. And so, Catherine, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kim. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
And I kind of want to wave down to John because I'm just up over the hill in Prospect from his house down in Orange Valley. And it feels like there's a real passing of the torch from down there. So you might be hearing the same tree frogs over where I am. I am going to be reading actually a story that was part of an anthology that Kim edited and put together and the department published, The Stories We Tell, and it's the Bermuda Anthology of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror. And so if you're wanting a taste more of Bermudian horror, science fiction, fantasy, I don't know if there are any true tales in there. But this piece I wrote called The Dying is fiction. However, it was written in response to a prompt for an event actually the department did several years back at Verdmont, in which they asked Bermudian writers to write stories inspired by gravestones in Bermuda. And I actually was inspired by a gravestone in the military cemetery that's right beside my house. It's a stone that marks the grave of a woman and a child, her child. And what is notable was their both last name was both Exeter. What is notable is that they both died on the same day. So, you know, I was drawn to tell a story of how that may have come to be. So, I assure you that this is entirely fiction, but that little kernel is true. There were maggots today. The girl, Nancy, forgot to take the kitchen scraps out for 2 days. And there they were, wriggling and inching through the rotting carrot peels and pork fat. Maggots make me think of Alexander's dead wife, Emma, and her son. I'm not the type to dwell on the morbid, please understand that. And I don't mean to disturb you by mentioning such things. I am merely seeking to be honest with you, because I treasure that I can be honest with you. The fear that what I say will get back to my mother or my sisters or their husbands is always there. And of course, you won't speak to them, not their servants either. That's really quite novel, having someone I can share thoughts, I think, but don't say. So I will say to you that maggots in the hottest days of August, when you can't breathe for the humidity and the sun has inched into your skin and is trying to drag it to hell, those days remind me of Emma. I, of course, didn't know the woman. She was near his age, 30, when she died. I say died because was killed sounds so dramatic, and I always drop down into a whisper when I say it. Wouldn't you? If you could, that is. But I was 13 when she and her son died, John Howard Alexander. I knew much about Alexander before ever setting eyes on him. His name was uttered in rapid whispers in our house, Alexander. A man to be pitied, my mother said to me when she caught me listening to the maids speaking to the housekeeper. We were going to church, waiting for the carriage to pull up. Elise, pray for this Captain Alexander. He is a man undone. They had searched the parish for 4 days after Alexander's wife didn't come home for supper. The disappearance shattered the habitual listlessness of His Royal Majesty's delegation to Bermuda. The garrison transformed into an ant's nest of green and khaki and sunburned skin. Everybody, whether male or female, elderly or juvenile, was called upon to play his or her part in combing the brush and shallow waters of Devonshire, Smiths, and Pembroke parishes. Though, as was my lot, I remained at Orange Valley, handed out small triangles of sandwiches to tired soldiers. All of us, the whole island, anticipated a dark outcome. But that did not temper our impatience for news, any news. And then, at dawn on the 5th day, a fisherman spotted her as he rowed out to the fish pots he kept near Seven Wells. I've taken you there, or near to it, the abandoned Fox homestead on North Shore by Devonshire Dock. My mother shared with me the tidy version of the discovery over breakfast that morning. The body of Emma Alexander was found floating in the water, and the child's body was found on the property. Of course, there was no indication of the who or the how or what of the discovery other than that. I did gather more details, though, mostly from the cleaning girl who helped Annie in the kitchen and was being visited. I think that's the colored word for courting, but I'm not sure, by one of the corporals at Prospect. According to her, Alexander wailed like a child when he saw his wife's naked body bobbing by the rocks at Seven Wells, that he waded out to her and shoved the men off her. He shook her as if he could wake her, yelling her name like she had just fainted or was sleeping or something, the cleaning girl told me in the parlor. She had to speak quietly because Annie had fallen asleep again in the pantry. It wasn't long before a soldier, the cleaning girl's corporal actually, found the baby's body in the buttery, buried under layers of salt in a barrel. Others had searched the buttery, she said with a puff of pride, but he thought to tip the barrel over. Without any light, her corporal felt the child first and carried him toward the door. His sailor's outfit was crisp and white, she said, and he was curled up as peaceful as you'd want a child to be, with his hands folded under his head. Though her corporal yelled out for the lieutenant, Alexander ran in first and wrenched his son from the corporal. Alexander fell to his knees with the child and screamed till 3 men tackled him down to the ground and clamped his mouth shut with the corporal's belt. Yes, his mind was gone, Alexander's. The cleaning girl said it cleared out of his body for 3 days. The whole time, they kept him in the barracks, in a storage room on a cot they strapped him to. She even saw him, snuck in by her corporal who was watching over him for a shift. He fought it every moment for 3 days, straining and bleeding where the ropes bit his wrists and ankles, his teeth gnawing the leather belt, saliva and blood and growling. And then, like a candle blown out, he stopped struggling. After 80 hours of nearly killing himself, he slept, the cleaning girl said. And that's when they found the simpleton with Emma's dress by Devonshire Dock. Like magic it was. Alexander fell asleep, and snap your fingers. The simpleton appeared in a spot soldiers had been patrolling for days, in plain sight where it hadn't been before. For 3 years, the Alexanders were, of course, the popular topic at our house. What with the arrest and then the trial, there were waves of new details that seemed to wash in every week when my sisters came for supper, accompanied by their husbands and carriage boys. I was young enough then to be ignored while the household gossiped, a non-presence to all, whether it be my sisters or the servants, which suited me just fine. A small fact: if you say little, people fill the silence. All their talk had a singular aim, whether they knew it or not, of making the Alexanders less like the rest of us. But isn't that the tragedy for you? You seek to reduce the randomness of fate's depravity. Perhaps they all wanted to believe that the Alexanders somehow deserved what befell them, the hot summer, the rotting corpse, the madness. Dare I say it? They say the child did not have the coloring of either of his parents. My sister Gertie flushed with even this meager suggestion of scandal. He had curly dark hair when they found him. Alice, my eldest sister, jumped in. And you know that no one saw him after he was born, not till he was found dead. And Emma Alexander? Oh, the whispered tales. She was a woman who would stare at you, Alice said, in a shop, at church, anywhere. She'd smile at you and hold your eyes as if she knew something she wasn't going to say. She once asked my husband how much his land would sell for, my sister Jane told Alice, and then just waited for him to answer. Would you believe that he told her, just like that? He wouldn't have told me if I had asked. You know that he wouldn't. It was like she tugged the truth right out of him. And the list of her lovers stretched over time, from the mulatto carpenter that lived on the foot of the lane, or the colonel, he had Spanish blood, don't you know, to James Fox, the owner of Seven Wells himself. His being nearly 80 didn't make a bit of difference to Gertie, who felt he had power over ladies that tied back to his Irish, gypsy, and Indian blood. He's got 10 children in St. David's alone, don't you know? Annie, our cook, knew that Emma was carrying on with the devil. You can tell these things by how a body floats, and it was floating the way of a woman touched by the devil. Other facts kept them occupied too. Minutiae are our currency on an island so small. According to my sister's telling, Emma Alexander also kept goats, at least 15 of them, and she had only the help of a blind colored girl who had worked the flowers at the Dill's house. My sister Lizzie, of course, was beside herself, a blind gardener. She couldn't believe her husband's father would make such a patently absurd decision. But by the by, blind or not, she worked for the Alexanders. Only in there, right before the baby was born. She was hired because she couldn't see the child and tell the others what he looked like. But she died first, the blind cleaner. All of my sisters agreed on that much. Screaming in her bed in the middle of the night, Captain Alexander told Dr. Cooper. He came to her bedroom and found her in her nightdress, half out of bed, with her eyes open and dead. A heart attack, Dr. Cooper recorded. But that wasn't more than 2 days before Emma Alexander and the baby disappeared. So this is how I knew Captain Alexander first. A man standing amongst the rubble of a haunted life. Yes, if you're wondering. They hanged the simpleton, Bushy Cartwright. It was too much for a jury to believe that another man had killed Emma and her boy, and then casually asked the simpleton to hold Emma's ripped and stained dress. But the simpleton was found rocking back and forth, muttering about the mean man who came with the dress, had no power on the jury either. Neither did Bushy's claim that the mean man told him he wasn't to give it to anyone because it had powerful magic and would come alive and kill Bushy if he gave it away. And even though no one truly believed Bushy killed Emma Alexander and her son, hanging the man was a relief for everyone. You could feel it. Amongst my sisters and their husbands, the ladies at Christchurch, even the servants were, it seemed, glad to see the whole Alexander saga come to a close. Neat and tidy it all was. Well, as neat and tidy as the hanging of a man who couldn't even tie his laces can be. Unfortunate, but that's that. I turned 16 the summer of Bushy Cartwright's hanging, and I suppose you wouldn't think less of me if I tell you that I had designed to meet Captain Alexander. I'd seen him at Christmas service the year before. My sister Agnes pointed him out for me, a tall, graceful man, Scottish and red-haired and watchful. Immediately before my coming out, I walked past his cottage 12 times. I persuaded my mother that seeing as old Mrs. Simmons had been ill and her only daughter lived in Somerset, that the widow could do with some company in the evenings. And of course, the Simmons house was the third cottage on Mary Victoria Road before you get to the road to the fort. And Captain Alexander lived in the first cottage, which I would pass on the to and fro from Mrs. Simmons. It was on the 7th passing that he was opening his gate, and we said hello. The next week, on the 12th passing, I twisted my ankle right outside his cottage. This, of course, involved much patience and planning on my part, but it ensured our future. This, I believe, was worthwhile. You see, a curiosity had been brewing deep in my belly since I first learned his name. Of course, when you're 13, you don't think about a man in terms of marriage, but you do think of how he lives. At least I did. How is it he can walk away from being bound to a cot in a storage room and his wife and boy being found dead and still say hello to another man on Front Street? What is love but just a particularly obsessive curiosity? And by that measure, I can say I had fallen deeply in love with Alexander before I ever saw him. The details of our courtship I've told you before, the secret meetings on the hill between Orange Valley and the fort, my mother's disapproval, of course, but that was merely a short-lived storm, for she was curious, as were all of my sisters, to observe him, bring him for supper on Sunday, and watch whether he would crack again. And given that I was a plain girl and the youngest of 7 daughters, would there be any better chances for me? He was, after all, still a captain. And perhaps for my mother, after surviving the dullness of my sister's husbands, a tragic and handsome widower sounded like an attractive addition to the table. So we wed. And here you are, our firstborn, our Emma. Your father doesn't speak of your namesake. Even now, he doesn't call you by name. It was my insistence that you were named for her. You are his child. Do not doubt it. Even he seemed to be relieved to see the red-headed baby in my arms after the screaming of your birth. So thankful was he that when Dr. Cooper asked what he would call you, your father merely nodded when I said Emma Elise. Of course, Dr. Cooper didn't catch the flash in Alexander's eyes. I alone saw that. Truth be told, your father does not disagree with me on anything. He acquiesces to my will. Our life together is the quiet dance particular to those who prefer silence. We can go a whole day without speaking, and for that I am thankful. We seem to be one body. One does not need to speak to one's foot to walk. So it is with us. When he does speak, it seems more to himself than to me. So it was yesterday when we left you with Nancy. Alexander walked with me to Devonshire Bay, where we watched the fishing boats go out in the early light. He asked if I could swim, and when I said I could not, he guided me down to the beach. He unbuckled my shoes and tugged my stockings off. By the hand, he led me into the waves, fully dressed, the two of us. He only stopped when I could no longer stand, and had to hop from toe to toe between waves when my face stretched heavenwards to breathe. He laughed at me as he scooped me into his arms and pulled my legs out straight with one hand. He told me to stop struggling. Be still, he said. Think of lying on a soft bed. And I floated. I have never floated before. What a joy to be so buoyant and light. A leaf carried by the wind, up and down. My face submerged and emerging, the sounds of the world muted. He didn't need to hold me any longer, but I knew his arms were poised just beneath me to keep me afloat. I opened my eyes, and he was watching me, smiling. He smiled still as he pushed me down slowly, one hard hand on my belly so that my head jerked beneath the surface. I kicked and gasped in water, screamed to the dead waves, clawed at his arms and scratched deep into his skin. And then he pulled me up, held me to his chest while I beat his shoulders with my hands. This, he said, is how she died. And I hope, dear heart, that you someday know such a love as this, blessed with a husband that holds out to you the secrets of his heart and knows you will never let them go.
Thank you, Kathy. It's such a haunting story. I remember when you first read this, if I have this right, it was actually for our October offering for Heartbeats. And I think it was the day after, or 2 days after Hurricane Nicole, I think it was.
Yeah. And we were lucky because everywhere on the island had no power. But of course, Vermont has no power anyway. So
Exactly. So when we were making the decision about whether to go ahead with the evening or not, we said, well, you know, it was already going to be by candlelight, so we all went down to Vermont by the moonlight and heard the story. Yeah, it was quite an experience. So
yeah,
thank you very much.
thank you.
Our last story for the evening is by Andrew Bailey. Andrew is, he's actually living in Edinburgh now, working in the art market. And he was on the archaeology committee for the Bermuda National Trust for 10 years. So this is actually the story I was referencing in my introduction that gives a little bit of a story with an archaeological bent. He sent me a pre-recorded video just because of the time difference. And so I'm going to actually do a share screen now so that you can enjoy his story. So this is Andrew Bailey.
Good evening, everybody. Sorry I can't be here in person. Kim kindly said I could record this and she'd play it back, which makes my life a little bit easier. I'm over in the UK right now, so a little bit in the future, and it was just a bit more convenient for me to record this rather than being up quite late into the night. So thanks, Kim, for that, and also thanks to Kim and to Kathy for inviting me to take part. So tonight I'll be talking about an excavation I and a few others did about 10 years ago on Hen Island in St. George's Harbour. And I'll talk you through the various stories that come along with that excavation as we go along. I'm going to give you a PowerPoint, which I did at the time of the excavation, which just adds a bit of marker here, St. George's, Smith's Island. So this is Hen Island right there. And if you can also keep in your memory the next little bit, that's Town Cut. And that little island between Smith Island and Hen Island, that's Peggy's Island. And both of those will come into play later on in my talk. And just very quickly, this is a speed map, so one of the early Bermuda maps. And if you see right here, we've got Hen Island, and it's actually called Hen Island. So it's not one of those places in Bermuda that changed names a few times over the centuries. It's been Hen Island from pretty much right from the very beginning, as far as we know. And indeed, on Norwood's survey, he has it listed, and it was listed as lying in common, which basically means it was part of the common land that was St. George's, not owned by the shareholders, who the rest of the island was split up into shares. St. George's and Smith's Island and Hen Island, and a bunch of other islands in the harbor were all lying in common, so they were for everybody to use in essence. And he also measured it out, he was a surveyor, so he knew how to do this, at 3 acres, 2 roots, and 1 perch. And your guess is as good as mine as to how large a root and a perch is. I'm sure it'd be a quick Wikipedia search, but I have no idea right now. So just very quickly, the history of the island. Not going to get into this too much. So it was held in common. It was owned by a few individuals over the next couple of centuries. In the 1790s, when the British took an interest in fortifying Bermuda, the Royal Navy got it, or the Royal Artillery, the British military in essence, and the Board of Ordnance got it. This Simon Fraser guy, I'm pretty sure he's the chap who bought Ordnance Island, and there were some shenanigans involved in that, with him buying it and then selling it for a small fortune. I'm pretty sure that was him, but that's not part of the story. More interesting was this magazine explosion, which happened in 1812. So there was ammunition stored out of Hen Island. Good idea. It was a far way away from any from St. George's, no other people living out there. However, when this exploded, it was a large enough explosion that windows and things in the town actually did get shattered. So it was a major explosion at the time. It would have been, quite something. You're just going about your daily business, and then all the windows around you shattered. So it was a powerful explosion, but nothing to do with the stories I'm going to tell this evening. Then we come a bit closer to present. We got Governor Wilcox, who used it as a weekend cottage. You just go over there, have a little R&R. Basically, the Bermuda government got it back from the military. The Wesleyan Church leases it, and then right up to present, the Rotarians, they perform some maintenance on it, and the Cub Scouts go over there for camps and things, and they feature in the story as well. So, where does this story take place? So, this is Hen Island, close-up shot. This little red dot is basically where all the action is going to take place. So, on this beach, this story starts on a bright sunny day, and about 10 years ago, bright sunny day, a family was having a nice picnic on the island. One of the children was having a little dig over in the corner here, digging away, and then got a hold of something, eventually was able to pull it out, and it was a human bone. And this sand in that area, it was close to clay and some sort of soily sand, so it was all nice and red and rather gory looking. The poor mother, I think, had a bit of a fright, and it was a bone was found. So the family, the father got in touch with me, and at that time I was part of the archaeological committee at the National Trust. So we went over to excavate the body. So here's part of the team. That's Linda Bend, Zoe Brady, and that's Virginia Adams. And so this is from my wife. So that's the little love story part of this story, and that's all you're going to get. So there we are, digging away. And this is Andrew Roberts. It was his family and his child that found the bone. So he was lending a hand. So basically we were just excavating, seeing what we could find, and basically there was a pretty well articulated skeleton right there, and basically in a grave. So we excavated the body. It was a bit time was a factor as it was in a tidal zone. So as you can see, we're on the beach, so we only had a few hours to excavate the body and do it as scientifically well as possible, but also as quickly as possible. And there's just another shot. So if you want this that way, a rule in there so you can get the measurements. So the big question, and where the stories come in tonight. So who was it? The most likely candidate that we have actual sort of historical records for is a guy called Thomas Squires. He was with the Royal Artillery. He was stationed out there on Hen Island. And again, there was still a magazine out there, so he was keeping an eye on all the equipment and ammunition that the military had. And in 1825, there was basically a bit of a storm, and the roof collapsed on him. And he died. And then this coroner's inquest, the short version is they decided if there had been two people stationed out there, there's a good chance Thomas Squires would have survived. So the roof landed on him, and he lived for a while, but he did eventually succumb to his wounds. So the most likely candidate is him. Whenever they got out there, he was either close to death or had died. And in those days, before you get someone to a nice refrigerated morgue, you would bury them pretty much as quickly as possible. And this was September, so it'd still be hot. The body would start to decompose pretty quickly, so you'd want to get them in the ground as quickly as possible. So the most likely candidate is this chap right here, Thomas Squires. However, that's not as interesting. There's a few other possibilities. I do put legends. There's no concrete historical record that I know of to support this. Any of these records are these legends, but they all revolve around Peggy. The first version is out of the Calvin, I believe it was, and basically Peggy was a slave, and she was over on Hen Island collecting wood, and she was there with one of her friends, or at least another woman. I don't know if they were friends or not, but this basically they got into a quarrel, and the other woman killed her. So hopefully she wasn't that good a friend. And so the other woman killed poor old Peggy and got a little bit worried, and she did want to have a quick glass of water. Decided to bury her, and she buried her over on Peggy's Island. So the island just next door. It's only maybe 30, 40 feet to get across to Peggy's Island. Supposedly, this lady on her deathbed uttered the words, "Neither the fish of the sea nor the birds of the air saw me kill Peggy White." And she said that on her deathbed, but it's unclear whether that was meaning she was guilty or innocent, because it is quite ambiguous. So that's legend number one of Peggy. Legend number two is that she was either a witch or a poisoner, and that she was found guilty by a court, and she was burned at the stake on Peggy's Island. And from the ashes of her ashes and the stake sprung Bermudian. Of course, this story sounds very familiar. It's also the story that classic, the Bermudians from her ashes as well. So this seems to be a bit of a sort of a regular theme with Bermudian states. You have the Bermudian coming up. Then the final one, which I only had verbally this story, was that Peggy killed her husband. So I suppose they were both out on an island. Peggy got a little upset and decided to take matters into her own hands, and she did her husband in. This is the story that the scout leaders tell Cub Scouts when they're out on the island to give them a bit of a scare. The sort of scariest part of the story is that Peggy killed her husband and then decapitated him, or she killed him by decapitating him, one or the other. So there was a decapitated man out there, and it is true, and I forgot to mention this bit before, that the skeleton we found was lacking a skull. So that does lead some credence to the final version that the Cub leaders are telling the Cub Scouts. However, it's the lack of a skull is not evidence. There's lots of other reasons why the skull might not have been there, and indeed there were other bones missing. So if we look at the location of the grave, there, again, people were buried in a hurry, and there's a good chance there's been quite a bit of coastal erosion. If you look at Norwood again, he listed at over 3 acres, and then Callan listed at 2.7 acres. So there has been, the island's got smaller over the last 80 years or so. And in 1917, Callan cut a bit. And those cruise ships, anyone that's been out there or anywhere close to where the cruise ship comes by, you know you get a lot of waves coming. So you would have had quite a bit of coastal erosion since the time that the body was buried. And you can just sort of see, and those are tree roots there. So at some point those would have been underground. The coastline might have been all the way out here when the body was originally buried. It just over the last 80 years, or almost 100 years now, but it has been over 100 years since the town cut was opened. The increased amount of large ships coming through. It just eroded coastline away, and it could very well be that at some point the skull was exposed and it got taken out with the tide, which is a completely plausible scenario of what might have happened. But in any event, those are sort of 3 legends of Hen Island and Peggy's Island. So we don't really know, but most likely the person that we found there was Thomas Squires, but we really have no idea whatsoever. So I'll leave that up to you to decide. You can either go with the archaeological evidence and historical record in the Royal Gazette, which is by no means conclusive evidence, or you can go with the legend and sort of go with the adage that every legend has a bit of truth somewhere at its core. So, I hope you enjoyed that. And yeah, it was a really fun dig. It was fun hearing the various legends and the stories. And I hope that was entertaining for you. So I'm not going to be there to take any questions. I'm sure someone else there might be able to help out, but I'm happy to answer by email if you have a question. Otherwise, have a very good evening, and thank you very much. Cheers. Bye.
All right, so that was thanks to Andrew Bailey for providing that. And I do hope you've enjoyed. I will invite you all to put some, if you have any questions, to put those into the Q&A, to type those in. I'll just mention by way of wrap up, when Andrew Bailey had told me the story that he was going to share, it actually resonated with a personal story myself, because I live out on Bethel's Island, and there was a skeleton, there were a pair of skeletons found here in August and September of 1986. And it just so happens that it was Detective Constable Graham Alderson who was on the scene to examine. And the way that they've described it was that the first skeleton was found in a shallow grave perpendicular to the western part of the house, had several thick roots growing through it, and had been laid out in an east to west position. They had essentially nothing at that time but a button to kind of give an indication of the age. They knew that the part of the house had been built in 1938, but they also were aware, just based on I think where the pipes were in relation to this, that the skeleton itself was more than 100 years old. They also, within a week of doing this construction work, a second skeleton was also found. And that one was under a sewer pipe that had been dropped down in 1938, which is how they knew that it was actually older than that. There was a write-up by Graham Alderson, and at the conclusion of it, he's indicated that there's a lot of supposition as to how these two bodies arrived on Bethel's Island. In the older days, they tell me that it was a practice for some families to have their own private burial grounds, and in the past, after outbreaks of cholera, and especially yellow fever, it was not too uncommon for people to bury their dead anywhere as soon as practicable. There was a very severe outbreak of yellow fever in Somerset area at about 1856, when people were literally dropping like flies. The button was used that was found on the skeleton was used in the early Victorian period, 1837 to 1865. So that would sort of fall within that time frame. So just sort of an interesting story, bringing it full circle, and certainly one that I like to tell my children when they're misbehaving. So do we have, I'm just looking in the Q&A. I don't see that there are any questions there. I would like to thank you all for attending, and I would like to thank all of our panelists, our storytellers, for their participation, for pulling together these stories to share with us in this virtual format. I'd like to just mention as well, I'd like to thank my colleague Graham Maurer, who has assisted greatly in helping to bring this together, as well as the Bermudian Heartbeats Committee, in addition to Andrew Birmingham and Catherine Hay, who are members of the committee. The other members of the committee are Meredith Eben, Lucinda Sperling, and Ellen Hollis. We're very grateful to them as a committee for helping us to come up with the topics for these events, and often helping us to organize them as well. They're an amazing committee who have helped significantly in unearthing these really sort of interesting and in some cases quirky stories about Bermuda's past and our traditions and our history. So with that, I will also mention a week from today, actually, we have our next Heartbeats event. It's in honor of the 400th anniversary of Parliament. We've recorded Mr. John Barrett and Mr. Arthur Hudson in conversation, and they're going to give a little bit of the story of and the history of Bermuda having one of the oldest parliaments in the Western Hemisphere. So I do hope that you will join us. You can email Mr. Maurer, and we're on Facebook in terms of the address, but it's gsmaurer@gov.bm in order to get the Zoom link for that. So I do hope you'll join us, and I'd like to once again just thank the members of the panel who have given us such a wonderful set of stories this evening, in some cases entertaining, in some cases very sad and macabre, but certainly in all cases interesting parts of our history that we are happy to know. All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Hang on, I have to hit live. Leave. Yeah.